let's just start with a little bit of the kind of your essential love of film and the films that you saw, the films that really made an impression on you and first gave you that feeling that of what cinema could do, and also maybe gave you an inkling of what you might be able to do in cinema.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first film I actually remember going to see, I was very young, was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I think it was the Muswell Hill Odeon, which is now an Everyman. Might have been the Holloway Odeon. And I remember very clearly being affected by it, particularly the scene where the evil queen turns into an old crone, the poison apple, being very frightened of that and sort of hiding behind the seats. I think as far as influential movies and things that sort of show me the potential of films, it was a very special time in terms of blockbusters. So George Lucas's first Star Wars came out when I was 7 years old, and The Spy Who Loved Me was the Bond film at the time. I remember going to see that in the cinema. And those are the kind of films that I think a lot of filmmakers, you come to film through the Hollywood blockbuster. Those are the big films that, as a kid you wind up going to see. I did have a very special experience of going to see 2001 on a film print because Star Wars was so successful. They re-released that film the year after that. So I went to see that with my dad in Leicester Square, at the old Leicester Square Theatre. It would have been on 70mm. And that was a film, I remember that experience very clearly. I remember just feeling the enormity of the image and the potential for that screen to kind of, just take you anywhere. Yeah.
And I guess seeing it at that age, or indeed any age with 2001, it is a question of you experiencing it rather than understanding every frame of it. It's a kind of cumulative effect, isn't it?
I saw it when I was 7 years old, and I think I understood it certainly as well then as I do now, maybe better. I think maybe better because you take it for granted, you experience it, and the beauty and the magnitude of the images and the feeling of traveling across the solar system or whatever. I mean that's the point of the film. It's a sort of wood for the trees thing. I think as a kid you're actually pretty open to those visceral experiences, and I think a lot of your appreciation of movies and the entertainment value of movies is very simple, and it's just experiential in that way. Yeah.
Did you also appreciate film as a kind of time machine as well, in that it does capture and transcend time? It can, somebody can die over and over again in film, can't they?
They can indeed. Yeah, I think some years ago I was doing an event in India with my friend, the artist Tasda Dean, who works on 60mm film, and has been very involved with me and with the BFI in film preservation. That is to say, trying to preserve the medium of film for future generations, for acquisition and for projection. And she pointed out that the camera literally sees time. And the more I thought about what she said, and I applied it to my own fascinations and my own interest in it for work, it's only in a post-film world where you can conceive of slow motion or fast motion or things running backwards. These are things that people before movies wouldn't have had any idea of or any thought of.
And that was something that you first appreciated through film, rather, because it was literature that you studied at university, but it was film that...
I did, but I mostly was making films and thinking about films, getting by in literature. But my interest in films has always been sort of overwhelming in terms of anything else going on in my life. And when I got to UCL, where I went to college, it was a film society, a student-run film society in the basement of the Bloomsbury Theatre. It's still there today, and you were able to shoot 16mm films, and then in the Bloomsbury Theatre upstairs we would project 35mm films and use the proceeds from that to pay for filmmaking. So even though I was studying English literature, I think I spent most of my time making films, actually.
And clearly you were attracted to film noir early on because, which I suppose is a kind of expression of the human psyche, isn't it? As much as having any kind of thriller content, and film noir and psychoanalysis kind of grew up together, grappling, didn't they? as an
Yeah,
idea?
I think to a degree. Yeah, I mean, I think film noir certainly. I think the attraction of that genre, particularly to a younger filmmaker starting out, it works at its best as an extrapolation of relatable fears and anxieties, and that's really the bedrock of the attraction of that genre for audiences. And so, when you're younger, starting out, and you don't know anything, haven't experienced anything, being able to extrapolate from your own fears and anxieties into a more universal realm, a more universal language, that's a really important tool for a filmmaker.
So when you came to make Memento, which was, I mentioned following in the introduction, which had obviously a noir kind of, the step then to Memento, which was, as it were, the breakthrough film, again, very much a kind of noir, but about memory in some ways, in a very complex sense. So what made you want to make a film, as it were, where the chronology was backwards?
Well, I think, in the noir tradition, there is a tradition of amnesiac films that Memento was certainly inspired by and tapping into, but it's based on a short story that my brother wrote and told me about as he was writing, in fact. And it's essentially dealing with somebody who can't make new memories. And ultimately what I decided in talking to my brother about it and tasked him within finishing his story is, if you could tell the story subjectively, that would surely be the most interesting way, trying to live in somebody's head like that. And so he, in his story, found ways to approach that. And me in the screenwriting, ultimately decided that if you inverted the chronology, then you'd put yourself in the position of somebody who doesn't know what's just happened. I mean, the revenge story is, it's a staple of movies and literature generally, and noir fiction in particular. And so it always raises interesting ethical questions. And I think Memento, more than any film I've made, really tries to suggest that the ethical framework of the dilemma is defined really by the point of view. So it really is a question of whether you're in his head or whether you're observing him from outside in terms of how you judge the ethics of how he's behaving.
So following on from Memento, you made Insomnia, which had originally been, there was a Norwegian film, and this was the Hollywood version of this. So you were working at that stage from somebody else's script, which is you're done with that after that. But I suppose Insomnia still felt a bit like, you were dealing with something that had originally been a kind of art house film. But then you go to the Dark Knight trilogy, which that's introduced you obviously to Warner Brothers, and then you go to the Dark Knight trilogy. Was that a big decision to go from something, you'd made such personal films until then? I know you were still starting out. Was that something that you and Emma Thomas discussed as, what you should do next?
No, not really. I mean, I think the notion of personal or not personal doesn't really apply to my work. They're all equally personal. And actually, I mean, the interesting thing with Insomnia was it was a remake of a very brilliant Norwegian film. And Hilary Seitz, who is credited with the screenplay, she had written a great adaptation of the original film. And then she worked with me. I was a great creative partner in rewriting. I then did the last draft myself. I didn't take a credit because she had done, the vast majority of the work, so that seemed appropriate. But I did write the last draft, and I do on all of my films. And so my relationship with the material is no different, really, than any other film I've been involved with, because some of them are adaptations, some of them are original. That one was a remake. Some have been sequels. Some are from novels. It's always different, and yet the process has to be always the same in terms of finishing that last draft and then me approaching it as a director. So no, I think where you see a more specific progression, and that was probably a little more, not necessarily self-conscious, but the scale of the films, grows in what for me was a very useful cadence, because we went from a no-budget film, Following was literally made, with friends, shooting on the weekend. We were all working, full-time jobs, and it was made for nothing. And then Memento was a low budget movie, but it was about $4 million or so. And then Insomnia was sort of 10 times that. So then by the time we get to the Dark Knight trilogy, starting with Batman Begins, we're working on a much bigger scale, but it was a pretty good progression, actually. So I felt I was challenged at every stage with taking on something bigger, but I didn't do what a lot of filmmakers since I did those films. There've been a lot of filmmakers who've gone from their sort of whatever their Memento is straight to their Batman Begins, and that's a very difficult leap. And I would not have wanted to have to try and make that kind of technical leap in terms of marshalling resources and everything. I feel very lucky to have done a more modestly budgeted studio film and learned a lot about how to make that work and working within that system before I then took on their larger scale properties.
And your vision for Gotham City and Bruce Wayne's travails was informed quite a lot by sort of European expressionism, by Fritz Lang.
Yeah, definitely. I think Lang's influence was more on The Dark Knight, actually. I think with Batman Begins, on the design, working with Nathan Crowley, who I worked with for years, he very much wanted to take it in a modernist direction. And I liked that and enjoyed that, and we pushed a little bit in that direction, but I felt that given the history of Batman, how he'd been portrayed on film before, even though we were trying to do something different, I didn't want to completely abandon the sort of gothic underpinnings of it quite so much. And so Batman Begins was more of a hybrid in that sense. And then by the time we got to The Dark Knight, we'd sort of built more confidence to take it in our own direction and push in a very heavily sort of modernist direction. And for the script, more than the design, really, I pushed my brother, who wrote the first draft of The Dark Knight. I pushed him very much in the direction of Fritz Lang, looking at Dr. Mabuse and things like that. This idea of the sort of master criminal in expressionist cinema, the relationship between the city and the master criminal. And I think it gave him a lot of inspiration, actually. I think visually that isn't necessarily as strong a relationship. I think it's a little bit more about almost sort of the morality of the thing, really, and the relationship between police and criminal underworld, and then the idea of some kind of geographical or architectural expression of that within the visual nature of the film. But obviously we were doing it in a more modern way, I suppose.
And also the kind of Faust themes as well, in that Bruce Wayne takes on this mantle of Batman at some considerable personal cost, doesn't he? There's a price.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it is a sort of deal with the devil. It's really that idea of a sort of means to an end, if you like. And I think the Batman mythology, one of the reasons that it's continually interesting and is continually reinvented by new generations of comic book writers and artists and filmmakers, is because that essential paradox, or that essential idea of a good vigilante, somebody who feels that they have to resort to criminal methods or be outside the system in order to fix the system. It's endlessly complex and interesting in its ethics.
And also the sort of twinning theme, which will turn up in your films, before and after, that idea, if there's a Batman, there should be a Joker. Were you surprised by the appeal of the Joker to audiences, how fascinated they were by him?
No, I wasn't, because when I read Jonah's first draft, it was a very unwieldy document, and it was long and took us a long time to kind of get it into a practical shape. But the character of the Joker was there, like this sort of engine running through it. I had told him I needed the Joker to be like the shark in Jaws. He needed to sort of come through and thread through the film with this particular energy. And he had just found that and absolutely cracked that, even in that first draft. And then when I brought Heath on and talked about it and how it was going to work and saw his ideas and his references, and as that started to come together, it was endlessly fascinating. very, very interesting to see. And as we shot with Heath, you know, right from the first hair and makeup test, you could see everybody on the floor just fascinated by him. I mean, it was just such a sort of interesting creation. And it started with Jonah's script, and then Heath's interpretation was so compelling that, no, I think we all felt as we were filming it that that character would have very, very special appeal. And I think the challenge actually of the film and the edit was to have all of the other elements in balance with that. So, you know, Christian Bale, Gary Oldman, everything, that, you know, their story, you know, you can't give it all over to the Joker, even though he's this incredibly magnetic and powerful force at the center of it. But no, I think we all sort of felt that really developing as we were making the film.
Yeah, I guess that the challenge is that billionaire Bruce Wayne is, you know, in some ways a less attractive figure,
yes.
You know, in cinematic terms.
Well, but I mean, a good villain. I mean, the devil has the best tunes. You know, that's the thing, and it's what really, as I say, it's the engine of the film. It's what really makes it work. So we all knew how important it was going to be, but it was thrilling to see audiences really respond to that.
And of course, there've been all sorts of interpretations from right or left about appropriating the Joker one way or another. I mean, what do you make of those?
Politically speaking, yeah. Well, I mean, we found that on all three films. People often attempting to put some kind of political interpretation on the films, but it sort of ignores the mythic landscape in which it take place. Certainly with Dark Knight Rises, which, you know, has its share of people pulling at it politically right and left. Either side of the political spectrum, in choosing to interpret the film in their own terms, they're willfully ignoring, you know, big chunks of the story to do that, or big chunks of the point of view. So really, it's important to remember the mythic landscape. The end of The Dark Knight is really drawn from Shane, the Western, you know, George Stevens' wonderful Western, and Out of the Past. You know, so it's mythic Americana, it's film noir. It's the Western. I think where people get slightly confused by it, or in that sense, is that it's a contemporary staging, because that's what works for Batman. But even though it's a recognizable sort of contemporary American cityscape, emotionally, you know, thematically, it's the mythic Americana of, you know, crime fiction and of the Western.
I mean, nonetheless, the films did anticipate the rise of kind of disruptor leaders in politics all around the world, didn't they? So do you think they were sort of their time in
I think they're very much of their time, in that, I mean, certainly with David Goyer, my co-writer, with my brother Jonah, my other co-writer, the attempt was always to just be honest about presenting the things we were affected by, things we were worried about, afraid of. I mean, certainly when I look back at Batman Begins, there's a heavy emphasis on terrorism, on the sort of post 9/11 world, but it wasn't something we were consciously putting into the film. We were just trying to be sincere and truthful about what moved us at the time. Certainly, the Joker for me and The Dark Knight is all about a fear of anarchy, you know, fear of the rules breaking down and what that would do to society. And The Dark Knight Rises is very much fearful of fascism, fearful of demagoguery. And I think, you know, I suppose in a sense we were sort of tuning into things around us in the world that we were worried about, and you know, some of them come to pass, you know.
So obviously you made other films during that trilogy as well. Did the fantastic success, I mean, the huge box office takings of those films allow you to do something like Inception, for example, which, you know, was very daring cinematically?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helped, yeah.
Sure.
I mean, coming off The Dark Knight, I think I've been working on Inception for a very long time. I never really tried sort of pitching it to the studio or anything, so I'd never really gauged the response in the absence of The Dark Knight. I'd probably been afraid to. But certainly following that film, when I took it to the studio, they were very receptive. They wanted to do another film with us. So that smoothed the way for what might otherwise have been received with some raised eyebrows, because it's an unusual film and a complicated film, and a very expensive film, which is a tricky combination. And so I think both myself, Emma Thomas, my producer and wife, who's somewhere in the audience here, where I'm single her out. She's going to stand up. There she is. I think we both felt coming off The Dark Knight that we had a very, very unusual opportunity to make something on a large scale with, I mean, not carte blanche, but with a lot of freedom. And so we sort of dove in head first to do Inception, because you're very aware when you get an opportunity like that. I mean, firstly, how much you yourself have wanted to do something very ambitious like that, but also how many other filmmakers there are in the world who don't have that opportunity. So you really feel, kind of an obligation almost to just take a risk and maximize it.
Can I bring in something else that obviously was happening around the time in terms of thinking about IMAX as a format? Because clearly, you're getting into an area where these films are just extraordinary. Was it something that you had in mind when you go to make a film? Are you thinking about that particular format?
Yeah, depending on the film. I had first experienced IMAX as a kid in museums around the world. Actually, Omnimax, which is the variant of IMAX. It's a dome theater there's not much of it around anymore. But in various museums in America, they had this format. You'd watch nature documentaries and things. And I always found it to be a very visceral, sort of overwhelming experience. I thought, well, why not make a film that way? And as I started to get into film, there was no way to do that. But right around, in the sort of 10 years leading up to Batman Begins, when I was in my early 20s, IMAX started showing, they created a process called the DMR process, whereby they could take a regular 35mm film and blow it up for their screens. So they started building IMAX theaters in commercial cinemas for the first time. And so by the time we got to Batman Begins, I was able to say to the studio, well, can we transfer this? We couldn't shoot in IMAX. No one had ever shot a thing in IMAX for those screens. But then you had to transfer it. And so I got to meet the IMAX guys blowing up Batman Begins, and it did well in that format. So leading up to The Dark Knight, I went to them and said, I'd like to take your cameras that have been used for nature documentaries, and they'd gone to outer space and up Mount Everest and all this sort of stuff, but no one had ever shot a narrative feature with them. And so we started looking into it, and it was a very large undertaking because no one had done it. There were a lot of unknowns, a lot of fears about it. But I had read an interview with James Cameron years before, where he had talked about whether you could make a film on IMAX and how that would work in terms of, and what he'd figured out, Cameron being the technical genius he is that you'd extract from the larger negative the smaller negative that you'd need for your regular release. So rather than doing different versions or whatever, you'd have one definitive version that you could transfer to your other distribution formats. And that stuck in the back of my head. So when we came to do it on The Dark Knight, we figured out how to do that, how to shoot an IMAX negative, which is a very tall frame, but frame within that, protect for a CinemaScope version, which is like the clip we just showed, and make it work in that way, and figure out which sequences we could shoot that way. The cameras are very loud, so you don't really want to do dialogue scenes that way. So we laid out which of the action set pieces we would shoot with the IMAX camera, starting with the opening of the film where we introduced the Joker. And yeah, we went ahead and did that, and it was a great success and kind of moved the format forwards, and I've been working in that format ever since because I just love it.
And that's really where the film begins with you, with the IMAX version, is it? I mean, is that what you think in, as it were? I
mean, yes and no. It depends on which sequences you're in. It's pushed us over the years. I'd certainly working with Hoyte van Hoytema as I have for the last 10 years or so. By the time we get to Oppenheimer, our conversations are a lot about it pushes you to a way of looking at cinematography where you're not looking at the proscenium, you're not looking at the frame and making two-dimensional compositions. You're really just putting the camera in proximity to the actors, and you're composing in a three-dimensional sense. you're sort of composing situationally, and then that gets formatted to different shape screens and holds up great. And Hoyte has a wonderful eye for that. So in its IMAX version, the extreme top and bottom, it's really about the peripheral vision. It's really kind of filling out the frame rather than boxing it in. So it's less a question of seeing things get boxed into particular compositions and more a question of pulling the frame away for that version. And so it translates, I think, very well to the other formats as well for that reason. So yeah, no, it's been a sort of ongoing experiment that we quite enjoy.
And moving on, as we inevitably have to do, given the constraints of time, to Interstellar. There was a treatment by the physicist Kip Thorne, I believe, which is sort of the basis, is it where you start, which is to do with relativity and gravity and all of those things. Is that where you began?
Well, Kip had an ambition to, the genesis of the project was Kip had an ambition to see a Hollywood film made based on scientific principles. And so he was friends with the producer Linda Obst, and they had sort of taken this idea to Steven Spielberg. And Steven hired my brother to write it. And so for years, I was aware of Jonah developing this project, writing about it, and so he would talk to me about it. And I thought it was pretty exciting. And then ultimately, Steven moved on and did something else, and so it became available. And I went to Jonah and said, how would you feel if I took this and combined it? I had a couple other script ideas that I wanted to combine it with. And he was willing to sort of, let me do that. And then we managed to negotiate with the studio so that we could take it on. And that's kind of where the project really came from. And in the finished film, the whole setup, the whole world of it, the whole first act is pretty unchanged from what Jonah developed over the years. And I worked very closely with Kip, who would work with my brother, and then when I took it over, I worked closely with him as well, to try and really mine his incredible brain for what are the possibilities of science? What do concepts of relativity offer you for a narrative? And Jonah had identified early on, in talking to Kip and researching it, he looked at a lot of Albert Einstein's sort of thought experiments. They tend to be very narrative, so they tend to involve a set of twins, and one goes off on a spaceship or whatever, one goes off on a train, and one is left at the station, and they come back in the different ages, and there's a sort of weird melancholy to them almost. And so a lot of that fed into his idea of what the story should be. And then I kind of burrowed in, further and further with Kip on the relationship between quantum physics and classical physics and, gravitational theory and all this stuff. And a lot of what, he came back with was truly stranger than fiction, really mind-blowing stuff. In visual terms, it found its ultimate expression in the look of the black hole in Interstellar, which Kip insisted he wanted to talk to the visual effects guys about it and everything. And I sort of was a bit worried about that, because ultimately you want something that kind of looks cool. You don't necessarily, it doesn't really matter if it's scientifically accurate. But what Kip had figured out, Kip had all of the equations that would explain, that would define how the gravitational effect of the black hole would affect the light behind it and how it would therefore look. He just really needed the computing power of our visual effects company to render that. And so he worked very closely with Paul Franklin, our visual effects supervisor, and they created this incredibly realistic rendering of a black hole. They actually published a couple of different scientific papers jointly about it. And then some years later, they actually managed to photograph a black hole in real life. And it was on the front of the New York Times, and I looked at it, and I called Kip, and I said, well, I guess you were right. Very glad to see that you were right, and our black hole holds up. And yeah, it's sort of become the kind of standard way of looking at it now. But it was all based on absolutely the real science.
So it's all moving towards Oppenheimer, I guess, isn't it? In the sense of wanting to make that story of the father of the atom bomb and the discovery of that force to make us feel as though we're there for it. Isn't that right?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think with all my films, I've had an increasing desire to really try and create an immersive experience and try and create a tactile sense of a world and you know, put you there in it. And I think that where that finds maybe its ultimate utility in Oppenheimer is the excitement or the tension of that story was always going to be based on, you know, can you actually be there for the Trinity test? Can you be in that room with these scientists deciding to go ahead and do this thing and experience those stakes? Because obviously it's a story that's ultimately, it's about, you know, people talking in rooms. It's not the most obviously cinematic, but the Trinity test itself in particular, if you can really feel that you're there for that, it would have been just the most extraordinary moment in history, you know, to be there, and the tension of that, you know, felt like it would be inarguable. And so, yeah, I think I brought my experience to bear in terms of creating that tension, creating that sense of being there. There's a lot of detail work and things that go into you know, feeling the tension around it, feeling that you're there. As I pointed out to Jen Lame, my editor, it's the second film I've done with her, but I said the thing I've learned about editing suspense is it's very tedious to edit, actually, because you have to repeat things a lot. You have to sort of keep showing the same thing, advancing at a particular pace, and you have to tune that pacing to the audience. And so Lee Smith, who cut the clip we just seen in Interstellar, there's a lot of work on how slow to make the robot relative, you know, to the wave coming and all the rest. And you have to be very mechanical and pedantic about how you put those sequences together so that the audience can understand what they need to for the tension.
And those are things that you can gauge in what way? I mean, how do you know what is the point where the audience will become incredibly frustrated because a lever is not moving or something?
Well, I think you have to feel it with your own internal clock. And then you sit with an audience and you watch it, and that sort of tells you as well. But one of the things I've learned over the years is to really judge it, you have to watch the whole film, because your sense of an internal rhythm is very, very different depending on where you are in the film. And the pace of the sequence you've come out of, you know. I often have the experience, particularly with the Dark Knight films, if they're playing on TV or whatever, and I happen to turn it on and it's in the last third or so, the editing seems bizarrely fast to me, and you know, it's somewhat choppy because it has to be to get that pace, but it works if you watch it from the beginning, so it modulates through the film. You can't edit things with the same rhythm at different points in a 2.5 hour film, and so to know where you are with something like the Trinity test, to really have a gauge on it, we'd have to throw the whole film up and watch it with an audience and sort of feel that internal clocking and how it was working.
Yeah, and of course it's different when you're dealing with history as well, because people sort of know the outcome. So do you have to modify it in a different way?
I mean, not really. I think the thing with cinema and the way it works is, I think, you know, when you go to see Titanic, you know the ship's going to sink. You know, it's you know the iceberg's coming, yeah. But I think you enter a different world, and that foreknowledge occupies a different space in your brain. It's not literal, I don't know what's going to happen. Whereas if internally in the film, let's say Cameron had decided to, you know, begin with the iceberg hitting the ship and then flash back, or, you know, whatever, that would weigh heavy in a different way. You know, it's really about what's within the text of the film in a way that you're judging. And so with Dunkirk, for example, you know, the suspense, we just treated it the way we would have with a fictional story. And I think when the audience is there in the theater and the lights go down and they engage with that film, they tend to take it on its own terms. And I think whatever the foreknowledge is only really enhances the suspense, actually. You know, in other words, you're sort of giving people the feeling that, yeah, they know that it's going a particular place, but it seems impossible that it's going to get there. That feeling works quite well. I mean, if you think about fictional cinema, you know, when you go see most action movies, you got a pretty safe bet that the protagonist isn't going to die. So, and you certainly know he's not going to die in the first 10 minutes. So you still have suspense. You still, if it's done right, you're still very wrapped up in those same dilemmas that intellectually you shouldn't be.
In the 21st century, is the role of film, or do you see the role of your films, to somehow make imaginable what has hitherto been unimaginable? Possibly even to show things that are, even maybe to get as far as sort of like the inevitable, the things that cannot be expressed in any other form except cinema.
Well, I think that's the ideal if you're making a film, is to take on something that can only really exist in this form. I do look for subjects that lend themselves to that, and I think that with Oppenheimer, the translation of a relatively academic source material, a piece of history, to something more immersive or more visceral, is what made it special for me and interesting to me. Because, I think you are looking for subjects that do in some way try to use cinema to do something that a radio play or a stage play or a television program couldn't do. One of the most sort of pure cinematic experiences I've had actually was working with Andrew Jackson, who's the visual effects supervisor on this. He was, after Emma, he was the first person I showed the script to because, I wanted him to be able to produce all this imagery in an analog sense. So there's no computer graphics and any of the things cut into that scene. They're all things that he found a way to photograph. Because I felt that he wanted something that would have the texture of the rest of the film and have a kind of real world threat to it and beauty to it. And I wanted to really get inside his head and imagine, what those things could be and have a language of immersive cinema that would allow the audience to see things through his eyes in a sense. And so Andrew spent months and months, himself and Scott Fisher, the special effects coordinator, working together, just trying all of these different experiments, but everything in there, including, the entire world being caught on fire. That's all stuff that he photographed one way or another. It's not CG at all. We use computers for compositing and stuff with these elements that he would shoot, but he would do all kinds of just crazy sort of mad laboratory kind of stuff with things floating in liquids and setting fire to things and all sorts. It was a lot of fun. No, I do have a particular way. The first script I ever wrote, which had a non-linear structure, was my script for Following. And I had the structure mapped out, and I thought the way to do it would be to write the story in chronological terms and then edit it to that structure. And what I found in that process is I had to do so much rewriting to make it coherent, to make it flow for an audience. So I never did it that way again. And every time that I've taken on a non-chronological structure, I've done a lot of thinking about it, working it out, drawing a lot of diagrams, things like that. But then I write the script from page 1 through to page 124, or in the case of Oppenheimer, page 180. But, always writing for the way that the audience is going to see it, sitting in the cinema seat. And I find that way you get the appropriate narrative momentum. You get the right connections between scenes because you're thinking of it in the right way. You're not sort of imposing the structure after the fact. So for me, that's been important to do. I mean, the answer is yes to all of that, I think. Different things at different stages. I have ideas that halfway through the first sentence of explaining it to Emma, I realize it's just a terrible idea and it goes back in the drawer. But I think for me it's important I tend to not try to write things too soon, and I tend to not try and explore them with other people too soon. If it is literally half-baked, it has a way of kind of dying on you, and then it's very difficult to resuscitate. So I tend to just keep those ideas private and work on them kind of in my own time and see if they amount to anything. And that can take a long time. I mean, Inception, we were talking about earlier, that was a script that I worked on for about 10 years off and on before I could really finish it. But every project's different. But yeah, I have plenty of, half-baked or stillborn ideas that don't see the light of day. Wow, that's difficult to answer. They all change in the edit a lot. But if everything's working right, I mean, as a writer-director, if the process is working right, even though we change them a lot, weirdly they wind up kind of the same as they were originally conceived. But every scene is a process of taking the input of actors bringing things to the table that you didn't expect, the photography being different than you expect, So I'm trying to think, I mean, certainly in Oppenheimer, the scene I think Jen spent the longest cutting was probably the scene with Boris Pash, played by Casey Affleck, where Oppenheimer sort of goes to the security services to try and at least give the appearance of cooperating about espionage. And it cross-cuts with Matt Damon's character, General Groves, on the train. We spent a lot of time on that because what the actors brought to it was tremendous. But if you tried to keep it all in, it was just way too long. And so that was one very specifically where, to feel the rhythm of it, you had to watch the whole film, because you'd cut a version of it that you really felt was absolutely compelling. But after, coming after an hour and a half of screen time, it would feel interminably long. So we were working on that throughout the whole editing process, visiting it, revisiting it. But it got to a place that I was very, very happy with. And very often that is the journey, because on the day, we knew we were getting brilliant performances from Cillian and Casey. All these incredible, awkward pauses and things. But to get back to that so that it's revealed to the audience in the way we felt it on the day took, 6 months of taking things out and seeing what's just the little bit that can remain. I mean, yeah, I certainly Oppenheimer, has elements of horror in it, definitely, as I think is appropriate to the subject matter. I think horror films are very interesting because they depend on very, very cinematic devices. There really is about a visceral response to things. And so at some point, I'd love to make a horror film, but I think a really good horror film, requires a really exceptional idea, and those are few and far between. So I haven't found a story that lends itself to that exactly. But I think it's a very interesting genre from a cinematic point of view. It's also one of the few genres where, I mean, the studios make a lot of these films, and they're films that have a lot of bleakness, a lot of abstraction. They have a lot of the qualities that Hollywood is generally very resistant to putting in films, but that's a genre where it's allowable. Not unlike, really, Oppenheimer bases the middle of the film very heavily on the heist genre, and the third act of the film is the courtroom drama. And the reason I settled on those two genres for those sections is they're mainstream genres in which dialogue, people talking, is inherently tense and interesting to an audience. And so that's the fun thing with genre. It can let you play with a lot of different areas where in a different type of film you really wouldn't be allowed to, in a sense. Unfortunately, I cannot possibly answer that question. It is, I mean, the cliche is it's like asking, which of your children is your favorite child or something like that. But it genuinely is the case. You pour everything you have into the film you're making at any one time. And so I really couldn't play favorites. And it changes over time, in truth. Your relationship with your own work shifts a lot over time. It's been very interesting seeing these clips of, films I made some time ago. Yeah. So, sorry, but...
That's up for you to decide, Lee, rather than us. Well, thank you, Lee, and everybody else for your questions. Thank you to the heroes in the projection booth who are running between projectors. Christopher is rushing off now because he's going to go and introduce a screening of Tenet at the IMAX, so he will have to depart swiftly and without any further delay. But thank you so much indeed for your time today.
Thank you.